Ding dong ding dong ding dong ding ding. Ding dong ding dong ding dong ding 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 ding. Ding dong ding dong ding dong ding 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 ding. Ding dong ding dong ding dong ding 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 ding.
Word nu lid van Basic Fit.
I just calculated how many planets there are in the observable universe, and you won't actually believe me. Our galaxy has around 100 billion stars. Each star on average has about 2 planets orbiting it, and there are 2 trillion galaxies like ours in the observable universe. When you multiply these numbers together, you get 300 sextillion planets. But what does that look like? Well, if you counted up all the grains of sand on every beach and desert on Earth, each grain would have to represent around 40,000 planets to account for all the planets in the universe. Another way to look at it is if we had every human on Earth go out and search these planets looking for aliens, each person would have to visit over 30 trillion planets if we are going to search them all. And here's the really crazy part. All of these planets represent just 10% of all the planets that will ever exist. 90% of them just haven't even formed yet. I just calculated how many planets there are in the observable universe, and you won't actually believe me. Our galaxy has around 100 billion stars. Each star on average I just calculated how many planets there are in the observable
If they're so valuable, let's sell them.
No way! I'm not collecting them to sell. I'm collecting them because they're simple and beautiful and because they make me happy. Why are you so money hungry?
If they're so valuable, let's sell them.
No way!
If they're so valuable, let's sell them.
No way! I'm not collecting them to sell. I'm collecting them because they're simple and beautiful and because they make me happy. Why are you so money hungry?
If they're so valuable, let's sell them.
No way! I'm not collecting them to sell.
Yes, 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 yes. Ho ho ho. No. Yes.
Conmigo ella se acabó, peligrosa, la nena me sigue la sensación del bloque, yo quiero.
Come on! What is this nonsense? Guys, I need some help. I'm lagging like crazy.
I was relieved.
Come on! Come on! What is this nonsense? Guys, I need some help. I'm lagging like crazy. Are there any other better emulators? I don't want to get bullied again because of lag. Yeah, right. Lag. LOL.
Hey, maybe try the official PC version? Rise of Kingdoms PC version gives governors the ultimate experience in
I was relieved that it was just a babby. That's when I takes closer look and realize, fat babby. I was relieved that it was just a babby. That's when I takes closer look and realize, fat babby. I was relieved that it was just a babby. That's when I takes closer look and realize, fat babby. I was relieved that it was
can you guess the date of the
What an unusual view!
Het geheim van heerlijke pizza. Casa di Mamma van Dr. Oetker. Met zijn knapperige rand die thuis rijst in de oven. Smaakt alsof je hem zelf hebt gemaakt.
Why did Russia conquer Siberia despite there being literally nothing out there at the time? At first, Russia went into Siberian land to prevent raiding into their big cities and get animal fur which could then be traded for money. But once Russia realized nobody was going to stop them if they just kept going east, they decided to conquer the entirety because it's basically free real estate. Siberia had very little people and it didn't cost the government a lot of money to govern or conquer. And it helped secure Russia's position by preventing hostile armies from conquering their land in the west, just like the Mongols were able to do a few centuries prior to this. Russia also conquering literally 1/8 of the Earth's surface also gave it respect and fear amongst the European powers, and would be one of the reasons why Russia was considered a great power thereafter. Why did Russia conquer Siberia despite there being literally nothing out there at the time? At first, Russia went into Siberian land to prevent raiding into their big cities. How did every country react to the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949? America was absolutely terrified since the most populated country in the world was now communist, and they feared China would seek an alliance with the USSR and refused to recognize the PRC as the real China while backing the ROC in Taiwan. The British weren't exactly thrilled since they saw the new China as a threat to its colonies in the region, but would soon recognize the PRC in order to preserve trade. India was one of the first to recognize the PRC, but would later have some pretty serious border disputes that would result in more conflict. The Soviets were pretty happy about the change in leadership and would go on to form an alliance with the Chinese that would definitely last forever and ever. Finally, France had similar concerns to Britain about communism spreading to their colonies in the region and delayed recognizing the PRC until 1964. How did every country react to the end of the Chinese What would happen if the Allied invasion of Normandy failed in 1944? Without the Western Allies opening up a new front in northern France, the British plan of attacking from the south to target the soft underbelly of Europe likely would have won out, and we would have seen an increased Allied advance into Italy and southern France, which would have been much harder due to the mountainous terrain. With the Allied setback in the west, the Soviets would be able to dominate in the east, and we would likely see them control a lot more territory than they did in our timeline. The war in Europe would have dragged out for much longer, and it's even possible that the Americans would consider using the atomic bomb on targets in Germany to end the war, as well as spook the Russians. Finally, Eisenhower probably would have resigned, and Roosevelt would have had a harder time winning the 1944 election, defeating Dewey by a much narrower margin. What would happen if the Allied invasion of Normandy failed? How did every country react to Russia leaving the First World War in 1918? Germany and Austria-Hungary were unsurprisingly ecstatic and quickly occupied a huge amount of Russian territory and began moving more troops from the east, which can now focus entirely on the Western Front. The Ottomans were also happy and were able to freely expand into the Caucasus and focus on fighting the Entente down south. The Entente powers were pissed and fearful of a now more powerful Germany, as well as the communists that were trying to take over Russia. America in particular would begin rapidly increasing the number of troops in Europe after they heard the news, and the Entente would begin to support the whites in the Russian Civil War. Finally, Romania was pretty much cooked after Russia left and was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty a few months later. How did every country react to Russia leaving the First World War in 1918? Germany. Why didn't the US invade North Vietnam during the Vietnam War? Although successfully invading the North would have probably ended the war, the US feared that if American forces directly invaded North Vietnam's spawn point, then China would most likely intervene and push the US out, just like what they did during the Korean War. The war was also extremely unpopular to the American public, and escalating the war even further would have made this problem much worse. Not to mention the Americans would have had to deal with even more jungle guerrilla warfare, which would have made the mission even more difficult. Finally, the containment policy was aimed at preventing the expansion of communism and not trying to get rid of countries that were already communist, because that tends to lead to some unforeseen problems. Why didn't the US invade North Vietnam during the Vietnam War? Although successfully invading the North would have probably ended. What would happen if the entire world went into a nuclear apocalypse? If you and your friend are the last men standing and you don't know how to start a fire, turn cotton into clothes, design a house, build a car engine, or basically do anything else to rebuild civilization, you are probably going to want to save this book. This book goes into depth about literally everything you need to know to build back humanity, covering everything from making penicillin to fishing and even learning martial arts. To be honest, my main argument for this book is just how beautifully drawn and organized everything is, which just makes the book actually enjoyable to read instead of just staring at a giant wall of text for hours. Why didn't Spain join the Second World War on the side of the Axis? Although Spain was ideologically aligned with Germany and Italy, it was still recovering from its brutal civil war, and its economy was in no position to wage a large-scale war. Not to mention there was very little to be gained from joining the war anyways. The Axis offered Gibraltar to Spain, but beyond that tiny rock, Spain had very little to go after. Franco was also aware that Germany was in no position to defend Spain from the US or the UK, especially after their little trip to the Urals in 1941. Finally, Spain was aware of the power disparity between the Axis and the Allies and found it best not to gamble on one side for almost nothing in return. Why didn't Spain join the Second World War on the side of the Axis? Although Spain had How did every country react to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962? The US was utterly terrified and declared a total naval blockade around Cuba to prevent any more missiles from being delivered, and President Kennedy would place the US military into DEFCON 2. The Soviet Union reacted with caution after the Americans found out about the missiles and used careful diplomacy to defuse the situation, proposing a deal to get Russian nukes off of Cuba in exchange for US nukes being removed from Turkey. The UK supported the US but feared an escalation to the conflict that could drag London into another war, so they kept in constant communication with Washington to help them navigate the crisis. China criticized both America and the Soviets and felt that the Russians were cowards for backing down and that the Americans were trying to bully Cuba into submission and being overly aggressive. Finally, the Cuban government was outraged and felt sidelined and betrayed by the USSR after the deal, and Castro said he probably would have fired the missiles if he had the power to. How did every country react to the Cuban Missile Crisis? Why was Italy so ineffective during the Second World War? The Italians suffered from a case of overconfidence and largely failed to coordinate with their strongest allies, leading to humiliating defeats, even against much weaker opponents. The Italian economy also wasn't nearly as industrialized as other European countries, which is why they lacked sufficient resources like oil and steel needed to wage war. This is why it was so reliant on German support. What would happen if Christopher Columbus never landed in the Americas in 1492? Without Columbus bringing major European attention to the New World, there wouldn't have been any major European settlements or colonies developed on the continent for a very long time. This means that indigenous civilizations like the Aztecs and the Incas would be able to expand and possibly gain new technology. Without America's vast natural wealth, the Spanish would never rise to become the European superpower we know in our timeline, and the entirety of Europe would likely fall behind other empires in Asia and Africa that were already far wealthier. Finally, Europe likely would have established some colonies in the Americas just much later on, and a lot of the events like the creation of the United States would be delayed or never even happen. What would happen if Napoleon never invaded Russia in 1812? Without the disastrous catastrophe in Russia that cost him hundreds of thousands of men, Napoleon would have been able to continue his wars for much longer and probably defeat the Anglo-Spanish resistance in the Peninsular War. Despite this, Britain would still be a thorn in Napoleon's side, and their naval and economic power would allow them to